Giulia Bernardi is a postdoc research fellow at the University of Padova in the field of theoretical philosophy. She works about the notion of philosophy and so on meta-philosophical perspectives in classical German philosophy, Kant, Hegel, Schelling, Jacobi, and she has her PhD in Padova and Bochum. It was a co-tutel between Padova and Bochum. The title of the talk today is Adequate Cognition Between Hegel and Spinoza, a Threat to Activity. Oh, a threat to activity? The floor is yours.
Thanks. So thanks for the organization of this wonderful and stimulating conference. And as you will see in a moment, I will try to take a stance in an ongoing discussion began yesterday with Professor Ferrer, Dr. Jovicevic, and Professor Holgate, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity. So in this paper, I would like to put forward the basis for investigating the question of method in Spinoza's and Hegel's philosophies, with emphasis on the effects it generates. By the term effect, I mean provisionally, the kind of transformation produced by philosophical exposition on recipients who engage with it and by performing it come to adequate cognition. Exploring the transformative potential of the works of Spinoza and Hegel presents a challenge at the outset. This is due to the fact that the crucial processes of their philosophies are not primarily concerned with finite modi or subjects, but with truth. The question then arises whether any activity that can be explained by reference to either the expression of substance or the exposition of the idea can truly be defined as activity in the proper sense. Are the effects on the readers an integral part thereof or not? And to what extent is it possible to consider the effects as something philosophy must essentially account for, rather than just a side effect of the substance and idea being expressed? The vagueness of the notions of activity, effect, as well as adequate cognition and truth already points out the problematic ambition of a comparison, its potentialities and the limits of a task of addressing a possibly shared methodological issue. The differences between Hegel's and Spinoza's philosophy are indeed striking and sharp, not only in Hegel's interpretation thereof, but also in the conceptual language that they develop between substance and subject. However, when trying to focus solely on Hegel's philosophical method in some of its most pivotal moments, family resemblances emerge that cannot simply be dismissed. They do not regard vague analogies, but rather quasi-literal references, though displaced in a different framework. The eternal idea, one reads at the end of the Encyclopaedia, quote, eternally remains active, engenders, and enjoys itself, end of quote. In these lines, it's difficult not to hear echoing the reference to Spinoza's blessedness, which consists in, I quote, love of God, a love which arises from the third kind of knowledge and must be related to the mind insofar as it acts, end of quote. Nevertheless, once one tries to focus on the family resemblances, the difference resurfaces, as Professor Zankarden has already shown. Among them, a differentiated emphasis on activity is to be noted. Against what one may expect from the image of rigidity in substance and differentiation in subjectivity, it is actually Spinoza who explicitly expounds a direct proportionality between adequate cognition and activity. The more one knows God, the more active one is. At stake is the wise man, whom Spinoza defines as the one who is more powerful and capable of doing more, whereas her power comes precisely from cognition. I quote, self-esteem, acquiescentia ipso, is a joy born of the fact that man considers himself and his power of acting. But man's true power of acting, or virtue, is reason itself, which man considers clearly and distinctly. Therefore, self-esteem arises from reason, end of quote. Bracketing for now a challenge in Spinoza's text that I will address later, namely the relation between the third kind of knowledge and reason, it can be noted that no similar emphasis on acting is to be immediately traced in Hegel's philosophy. While it is beyond doubt Hegel's redetermination of rationality is essentially coupled with freedom, Nevertheless, it seems at first not to be explicitly coupled with activity and action as it is explicit in Spinoza's philosophy. On the contrary, according to Hegel's philosophy, seems to imply an attitude that is rather coupled with a kind of passivity. The philosophical enterprise, Hegel claims, consists in, I quote, conducting a genuine examination such that in the scientific development, the only thing that remains to us is poorly to look on. One should be simply a non-looker, das reine Zusehen. The phenomenological restraint to the tendency of subjectivity to make our own contribution is upheld in the science of logic, where true rationality seems to act in a quasi-objectivistic dimension against which the subjective thinking should be subjugated in a way. It is the thought determinations that have us in their possession, end of quote. It could be rightly argued that considering the finite subject as passive is a preliminary condition, so to say, a kind of attitude whose absence hinders proper philosophical discourse. However, it is still important to note that Hegel presents logic as such, as the, quote, absolute Bildung and discipline, Zucht of consciousness, end of quote. Whereas an important aspect thereof is precisely to hold back additions to the process of thinking and to learn avoiding dependence on habitual patterns of thought, relying only, on the contrary, on the path of thought determinations. In my paper, I claim that relying on the different emphasis on activity is a move that, though already helpful in mobilizing the relation between substance and subject, is not straightforward to explore the two philosophies. To enhance our understanding of the specificities of Spinoza's and Hegel's philosophical work, I propose to investigate the extent to which the methodological exposition may be seen as inseparable from the active engagement it generates. More precisely, I aim to show how Spinoza's exposition of substance and Hegel's justifications of philosophy's concept are significantly inseparable, though not primarily dependent from experiencing, gaining, and recognizing a certain activity. To this aim, I discuss the ethics' own advancement with regard to the second and the third kind of knowledge, and the philosophical account of the issue of discipline displayed in the Encyclopaedia. And I start with the latter. I think that, unlike Kant, Hegel regards the justification of the question of participation as well as the question of cognition and activity as essential for philosophy. According to him, I quote, philosophy must be taught and learned as well as any other science, end of quote. One reads in the 12 Gutachten Tunitama. The issue is not negligible, for it seems precisely a question of sight, of which philosophy, being its own time apprehended in thought, should account for. In the rationalization processes of modernity, as well as in the growing need for the publicity of law and of what interests our social life, according to Hegel, I quote, die Bildung der Welt hat eine Wendung genommen, der Gedanke hat sich an die Spitze alles dessen gestellt, was gelten soll, end of quote. In this epoch, philosophy emerges as the form that better suits to teach us to understand the contradictions of our living conditions and to recognize the universal and the contingent. Such a diagnosis that certain life-word contradictions and philosophy is on time with the search for their understanding in thought does not mean, however, that everyone consciously participates in this contemporary need from birth. Still less does it mean that philosophy is already secured as justified knowledge for this task. The diagnosis cannot serve as a fixed point, it is rather part of the process in which philosophy shows itself as justified cognition, a cognition which, according to Hegel, in order to be truly scientific, cannot presuppose anything. And here I think an explosive complication comes to the fore. For philosophy to be itself, so to be on time and be the proper understanding of this need, must proceed philosophically. That is, it must justify its concept without relying on anything else. But precisely this need for scientificity seems not to lead to directly account for the interest of our freedom, since philosophy's own interest should be to account for itself. So how can philosophy be properly philosophy? My interest in the Encyclopaedia relies on the fact that its ambivalent nature in a way embodies this paradox and mirrors the appearance of a separation between philosophical and the didactical issue. The text should serve as a manual, a textbook, it contains dry paragraphs, seems to belong to the former metaphysics, produces a kind of estrangement effect partially analogous maybe to the geometrical order. On the other hand, it is meant as, I quote, a new elaboration of philosophy according to a method that will be recognized eventually as the only genuine, true one, the only method that is identical with the content, end of quote. If philosophy, through its discursive presentation, is to prove itself capable of accounting for itself, then it cannot take the advantage the other sciences have of presupposing its method and subject matter. It must derive them in its own discursive unfolding. In this process, even the Einteilung of matter, its own presentation as science, is for Hegel crucial. Unlike the other sciences, and maybe also the ethics in the eyes of Hegel, where the Einteilung of the material is stated from the outset by means of titles that set forth a sequence that it is not in the matter, because it does not find a demonstration within the science, because content and form are not connected with each other, philosophy should be self-aware of the development of its own concept. Though, precisely in this process of immanent unfolding, we face something maybe unexpected. For we encounter the definitions of absolute, the metaphysical definitions of God. At each thinking determination, immanently exposed, corresponds one of them. So absolute is being, it is nothing, it is infinite, it is substance, and so on. Under such definition, Hegel collects structures from the history of philosophy and from religions. At first, the definitions seem something superfluous or that at best belong to a pedagogical facilitation as definitions, something that in any case does not and should not contribute to the process of philosophical determination of truth. And this says Hegel explicitly. Despite the initial warning, the entire process of the Encyclopaedia, as well as in Science of Logic, but this in brackets, which advances in an immanent and necessary manner, is punctuated by such definitions, to the point that even its final determination, namely the absolute idea, is referred to in terms of the point where all definitions become absolute, that is, they are fully understood and criticized. Why such a systematic critique thereto? Why did the science produce them instead of abandoning them at the opening door of the science? The first answer is because definition as such has to be proven to be insufficient. Beginning with the structure of judgment in the paragraph 30 of the Vorbegriffe and ending with the critique of the formal structure of the definition and theorem in the idea, paragraph 166, the science actually comes on the side of the content, namely of the thought determinations, to exhibit the form of definition and to criticize its limits. This shows a transformative potential because the exhibition and critique of the definitions proves us that our ordinary grammar, with which we mostly orientate ourselves in the world, implicitly contains several metaphysical claims that, being mostly unconscious, subjugate our capacity to deal with actual transformation. But I think that the question regards, above all, the organization of the science as such. Just because the form of definition has been endorsed, its critique is not something presupposed, but rather scientifically performed on both sides, to the point where content and form overlap and the method can be said to be true. By assuming the form of definition and coming to criticize it on the side of the content, science reveals to be critical not only to the form of knowledge of ordinary consciousness or of other sciences, but also to the form itself assumes, and comes to a systematic development not by just considering an alternative to the definition, by immanently overcoming its limits in it. At the end of science, in the method section, in the absolute idea and the three syllogisms at the end of Encyclopaedia, the scientificity of philosophy is further revealed as inseparable from the process that lead to it and that produces transformative effects. In this sense, philosophy arrives at this concept by making the subjects the recipients of a science that is learned in the process of its consummation, and in the same process establishes its own truth and purpose without presupposition, neither the cosmic dimension in which it should function as cognition, nor the audience's conscious belonging to their own world and time. In this radical questioning, the proof of timeliness of philosophy is then inseparable from the process by which subjects learn to dwell on the universal, to deal with the contradiction in which one is caught, liberated from the illusion of thinking reduced to one of our instruments. Now I go to Spinoza. The story of Spinoza is significantly different. It is another epoch, a different consideration of freedom and also of teaching. I think, for instance, at Spinoza's refusal to teach philosophy in Heidelberg. Their difference concerns also the method, which, according to Hegel, would prevent the kind of self-reflexivity displayed by the idea. If one thus suspends Hegel's critique to Spinoza's geometrical method and considers it, one is confronted with a much more complex landscape. For our argument, the question is, how does the ethic advance? Advancing in geometrical order, the ethic starts from causa sui and articulates the actual expression of substance. To express substance, the ethics advances with the presentation of the attributes and finite modi. Where does the ethics end? It ends in the fifth part, entitled On the Power of the Intellect or on Human Freedom, a result which is gained through the power of demonstration. What kind of transformative effects does this advancement produce? And I think this would be my proposal. Precisely here, a crucial role is played by the scholium to Proposition 30, to the second part of ethics, where Spinoza distinguishes the three kinds of knowledge. And as we know, Spinoza provides the example of three ways of arriving at the fourth propositional number of a series. What strikes me in the example is that for Spinoza, each of the kinds of knowledge eventually arrives at the correct fourth number, though designating a different means of reaching the same conclusion. At least, Spinoza, as I understand it, seems to hold a continuous position about the second and the third kind of knowledge. Both reason and intuition concern adequate ideas. An adequate idea, a quote, considered in itself without relation to an object, has all the properties or intrinsic denomination of a true idea, end of quote. Furthermore, by including its proximate cause, it can only beget adequate ideas, and thus the procession from an adequate idea of common properties, reason, or the essences of attributes, intuition, is necessarily true. With regard to the third kind of knowledge, Spinoza claims that, and I quote, this kind of knowing proceeds from an adequate idea of the formal essence of certain attributes of God to the adequate knowledge of the formal essence of a thing. End of quote. If we, once we have crossed the whole path of the ethics, with the most genuine effort to follow the geometric order, step back in a way, we see a proceeding at stake. For we have followed the rich path of expression of substance that proceeds from the adequate cognition of the attributes to the essence of a singular thing, whose power at the end of the ethics is fully explored, namely the mind. But here it is our mind also at stake. If this argument may appear possible or sound, it may be not excessive or not too excessive to understand the ethics as enabling the experience of a proper activity, relying on reason but different from it. This is maybe after all not too provocative, is suggestive, I think, where it is argued that, quote, the mind's intellectual love of God is the very love of God by which God loves himself, end of quote. It is precisely in the scholium to one of the most fundamental propositions of the whole ethics, namely the scholium to proposition 36, as already said yesterday by Professor Holgate, that Spinoza states that, and it's a longer quote, I'm sorry, but I will read it aloud. Because the essence of our mind consists only in knowledge, of which God is the beginning and foundation, it is clear how our mind, with respect both to essence and existence, follows from the divine nature and continually depends on God. I thought this worth the trouble of noting here, in order to show by this example how much the knowledge of singular things I have called intuitive or knowledge of the third kind can accomplish, and how much more powerful it is than the universal knowledge I've called knowledge of the second kind. For although I have shown generally in the first part that all things, and consequently the human mind also, depend on God both for their essence and their existence, nevertheless that demonstration, though legitimate and put beyond all chance of doubt, still does not affect our mind as much as when it is inferred from the very essence of any singular thing which we say depends on God. End of quote. There are, I think, lots of elements noteworthy. What is at stake is the essence of our mind, whose explanation regards a knowledge based on God. This is what has been demonstrated, as Spinoza says, shown, since the beginning of the ethics by means of ordo geometricus. But now something further seems to be possible, and this is a knowledge that accomplishes more, says Spinoza, and is more powerful, for it regards the essence of a singular thing, whose essence, which is knowledge, proceeds from God, from the adequate knowledge of the former essence of certain attributes, namely thought, and is sustained by it. This is not meant to weaken the power of geometry. As mathematics, in the example of the three kinds of knowledge, stands for spontaneity of the mind, as a power, as Anna Sharp suggests, grounded not in one's appetites with respect to empirical objects, but rather in the joy the mind experiences in generating adequate ideas, geometry offers the force of demonstration by which one can understand the causes of ideas and thus be inspired, so to say, with the eyes of the mind to see their truths for themselves. What is treated in the fifth part is indeed, I quote, the power of reason showing what it can do against the affects and what freedom of mind or blessedness is. From this we shall see how much more the wise man can do rather than the ignorant, end of quote. What is shown is that there is the possibility, I think once and since one has crossed the ethics, to catch in an example the power of the mind, something that it can see in a glimpse, so to say, or at least it can experience and learn to recognize by understanding its own power and spontaneity, which radically differs from the illusionary images of spontaneity, and think at the appendix to the first part of the ethics. To conclude, I come back at the beginning. What is at stake for both Spinoza and Hegel is the proper determination of rationality, one that, though highly differentiated, is affected by analogous problems. One of these being, for instance, the charge of elitism in all this discourse, hunting this discourse. Even if philosophy is art, it is not the unique way to gain self-comprehension, and it is an activity which requires rigor and efforts and pertains to the rarest things. I think both Spinoza and Hegel aimed at showing how its performance may allow us to experience the kind of activity that we seek to recognize in our understanding of our world. Such a liberation, I claim, is powerful to the extent to which it is gained for the first time precisely in the same process of expression of substance and of exposition of the idea, and not elsewhere. For blessedness is not the reward of virtue, but with virtue itself, says Spinoza. What I've tried to show is not meant to let the two models overlap. On the contrary, I just hope that the experimental, in a way, picture could help set the basis for further understanding what is at stake in Spinoza's and Hegel's philosophy, or even in the space between substance and subject. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Giulia. We have a little bit of time for discussion, questions, or clarification. Please, Bojana.
So, thank you for this very interesting talk. Is this? Do you hear me? Yeah. So, thank you. Yeah, I have a lot of questions in my mind. It's a great topic. So, maybe two. So, as you put it well, I think that the third kind of knowledge is adequate cognition and dependent on the second one, and it concerns rational cognition and reasoning. That's true, and it's a power of cognition and bound with activity. But now the question is, so we have a distinction. You seem to have made a distinction between, okay, adequate cognition and activity in the sense of power of cognition and exercise of this power. So my question would be, how do we exercise this third kind of knowledge? And it seems to me that you suggested, I went with a line of practical activity, but it seems to me that you've suggested the opposite, kind of giving through the experience of the whole ethics. This was your suggestion. So this is the first question. And the second one, at the beginning, you've connected thought determinations with passivity in Hegel. Now, it's true, we do operate with thought thinking itself, but I don't think that this is separate from me or you or us who are thinking this thought that thinks itself. And this does not mean that it is me or you and us who are the origins, who carry the origin of this thought, and thus resulting in a purely subjective view. This would be Fichte, but there is a positive correlation nevertheless, because we are not just externally observing the development of thought, thinking itself, but we take an active part. Now, so I would go back to this question on passivity and activity and thought determination, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. There are lots of insights there, so I will try just to catch some of the suggestions you gave. Also with regard to the talk you held yesterday. I think that, as you say, I find your interpretation very inspiring. So the action and role of the practical, so to say, in a way, in your reading, they overlap. I would be resistant to such a overlapping, at least in the ethics, for the part that I've understood the Spinoza argument. For it seems to me that Spinoza is defining and also repeats this issue. The mind, insofar as it as knowledge, it acts. So action and cognition are the same. And we have a kind of, I would say, definition, a broad definition of action, which is not the practical as we would expect, in the ethics, I mean. Action is coupled with adequate cognition. The more we have adequate cognition, we are already acting. So we have not to translate, so to say, some cognitive effort than in reality. I think that Spinoza is trying to revise precisely this model. Hegel also is trying to revise this model. And I think that the practical dimension would ask us to also confront with the political traits, not just the ethic, as I would say. So I would say that there is emphasis put on activity, and such an activity is coupled with cognition. But your question was pointing out the question of exercise and gaining this activity. And I think this is a wonderful question, because I think that, as many of us, I think, I find the examples Spinoza gives with regard to the three kinds of knowledge not very much helpful in really understanding what is at stake. The mathematical example, at stake in understanding what would be the exercise of this third kind of knowledge. The mathematical issue, I think, and maybe Professor Kolbe also would go in this direction, I think, but we will see. The mathematical example gives us an example of a kind of spontaneity, of a kind of productivity of the mind. So it suggests that the third kind of knowledge is coupled with activity, and activity has to do with a kind of spontaneity, which is not the spontaneity we usually experiencing. Maybe it's another kind of spontaneity that has to do with productivity. And my suggestion was to say, and I see a risk in my suggestion, was to say that the ethics maybe incorporates an example of gaining or of experiencing this kind of power, but I was not suggesting that this is blessedness once and for all. I think that the part of the exercise of a power is essential for Spinoza, not just that we read the ethics once and we are blessed and then we have virtue and that's it. I don't think this is the case. But I think that this column, I think that this column is emphasizing the possibility to see, this would be my proposal, to see the possibility of gaining and experiencing this power of the mind. With the just briefly to the other question, is it very briefly? It's really important. I was trying just to sketch, bisschen zugespitzt, the alternative between passivity and activity, and I was saying this is not helpful because passivity in a way also enables we have to make a decision to think freely, of course. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, Giulia, but my role is not so kind. We have 3 questions, Stephen, then Professor Kobe, and then Frau Zahn-Kaulen. No, only Kobe is professor here, only Kobe is professor.
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. It triggered a lot of thoughts, and I guess I wanted to just give you a few thoughts and basically get your response to them. There seem to be 3 possible differences that either I'm getting out of your paper or your paper is triggering in my mind between Spinoza and Hegel. One of them is that, and this does rely, I'm afraid, on the way I understand the second and the third forms of knowledge as I articulated yesterday. But the Spinoza seems to be arguing that we can have an intuitive grasp of what we understand philosophically. Mm-hmm. Now, this is not equivalent to Hegel saying, yes, we can understand through art the idea. No. This is different. This is the very form of philosophical understanding, in a sense, can be grasped at one glance. Mm-hmm. That seems different from Hegel. Mm-hmm. The emphasis on joy, when Spinoza says we are affected more deeply, what I think he means by that, it's not like Brecht, we're sort of moved to rush out and act when we go to the theatre. Right. It's that we are affected with a deep sense of joy and blessedness. I don't know that Hegel goes on quite as much by saying, how much joy we get out of reading the logic. I mean, it's hard work. But I think that's really important. I think Spinoza means that. And the other thing, I think this is a real difference, is that for Spinoza, because of the parallelism, thinking just is bodily activity expressed in another way, or bodily activity just is thinking. Mm-hmm. So there's no need to put things into praxis. Whereas I think with Hegel it's not quite that easy. Obviously there is a difference between contemplative activity and practical activity. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I'm sorry if those, I kind of was I either heard those things in your talk or they were triggered in my mind. But I just wondered if you could respond and see if you agree or disagree. Yeah,
thank you very much. Very briefly, I try to be brief. The emphasis you put on the question of joy, I think it's crucial for the argument because joy is something that affects us with the idea of us being the cause or God being a cause. Yeah. Right. No, but in this column to proposition 31, Spinoza says, we can check, Spinoza says, please, Spinoza says, the joy we experience in the third kind of knowledge is the joy considered as the cause and consequently God as cause. And I think that precisely this inverted processuality, so to say, is what is at stake in the ethics as such. In the geometrical way, it is articulated with the power of demonstration. And your question... Right, of course. I think that what adds the third kind of knowledge is the possibility, I would say so, to consider that proceeding from God to mind as such, also at a glance as implying our power, our mind essence, the essence of our mind implied in precisely this procedure. And this would be the intuitive, so to speak, at a glance. This would be what this column, and it is a column, we can also argue about that, the possibility of a difference between what reason as such as displayed before our eyes and the essence of our mind. And this is something that we experience. We see the power of the mind precisely experiencing our capability of proceeding as the substance has done. In a way, maybe it's too extreme, but this would be the direction I would go into in a way. No, thank you.
Thank you very much. It was really inspiring. I will basically repeat what has already been said about passivity, activity in Hegel. Das reine zu sehen. On the one hand, there is a set of other formulations, Anstrengung des Begriffs, die Arbeit des Begriffs, and so on, that directs in the opposite way. But I think that this is the structural problem in the Hegel himself, where on the one hand, you have those jokes about what Selbstdenken means, but that doesn't mean that we are not supposed to think ourselves. So there is a tension in this expression that should be conceptualized. For instance, it's the same thing with Eigensinn, that on the one hand is Eigensinn, arrogance, I don't know, that on the one hand has to be wegarbeitet, polished in order to think, but on the other hand, it's a crucial sign of the modernity that should be cherished and nourished. And Hegel speaks about the Eigensinn that honors the humankind. So the problem would be how to think these two within the same notion, according to you. But briefly, please. This is one thing. And the other is the transition from the second to the third. I basically agree, but I would add another perspective. If we refer to the Intellectus de Tractatus de Intellectus Emendatione at the beginning, there is a description of his entire philosophical project would be, and he says to enjoy perhaps with others if possible, because this. In which way then this intuitive science is not just personal experience, working, on myself to become a better man, but is something that is conditioned with a certain political, societal conditions. Thank you. So, briefly, please.
Yes, thanks for the constraints. Yeah, with regard to the first question, I totally agree. One should conceptualize this kind of tension. I didn't, so sorry for just having put not effort in distinguishing, in maybe in polishing the concept of passivity. You are totally right, and one should precisely take the chance to discuss what modernity as such has brought to as a challenge to philosophy, not just to diminish that. The second question, very briefly, already in the Ethics, Spinoza is very clear that although there are things that we read at the end of the Ethic, although such things that produces joy are rare and are difficult, this does not mean that it is a solitary experience. He is very clear in expounding the proportionality between the more one adequate knows, the better knows God, and this kind of activity is an activity that man tries to perform in a community. So you are perfectly right, already in the Ethics, Spinoza is very clear in this direction. For precisely love has to do with the need to share such a joyful experience with other people. Of course, in the Tractatus, then there are other instances, and also in the theological political Tractatus, Spinoza seems to be more explicit on a kind of elitist project, but I don't think this is the last answer to the question. And I think that already in the Ethics, Spinoza points toward the need to share such an activity. And this means that joy is not just to read the Ethics alone or something. Sorry.
Thank you very much for your talk. I wonder if we should confront at this opportunity a very deep difference between Spinoza and Hegel. I point to the title, Ethics.
Right.
And I want to say that Spinoza is not talking about philosophy, but on our ethical life. Mm-hmm. And the practical impact is the fundamental intention of the whole procedure. And therefore, community or my single life, it's the question of enhancement our life. Mm-hmm. And this idea points to the three types of cognition, mm-hmm. Naturally. But it's a question of enhancement, I repeat, our ethical life. And mm-hmm. this idea I does not see in Hegel.
Right.
The normative mm-hmm. Attraction. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure.
It's a transformation. It's really a transformation. Yeah. We have no book from Hegel called The Ethics.
Right. I would maybe resist, but this would. Yeah. Right. They are different, the projects. You are perfectly right in pointing out that. I would resist, though, to suggest that Hegel does not have an interest in that, but this is another story. With regard to Spinoza, I think that it's true that Spinoza actually does not speak about philosophy as such. You're right in that. But in the Ethics, he often takes a stance with philosophers who do not actually see the right way of proceeding from God to the singular things. And so I think that philosophical issues and ethical instances overlap in Spinoza. And I think that, at least in the Ethics, I mean, the Ethics does not stand alone, of course. There is the political also instances that is treated in other treatises. But I think that already in the Ethics, the cognitive part is precisely action. It's not something that does not have to do with power, with virtue, with activity. It is blessedness, virtue, and this is experiencing our power once we have understand us as a finite modus, so to speak. So I would maybe not differentiate between that. The emphasis I put on philosophy was to discuss the methodological issue, but you are perfectly right that the question is a question that motivates Spinoza to call the book Ethics and not science of logic or something different, but we may discuss also the science of logic. Thanks for...
I'm aware I am forcing the organization, but I would like to give a little short question to Giacomo and perhaps Pina. But really 10 seconds and 10 seconds and 2 seconds for Giulia.
So, thank you. Thank you for your impressive talk. I have a really short remark question. So, you say that Spinoza activity and cognition are the same. Mm-hmm. So, that means that definitions at the beginning are generative. They have a generative activity. So the problem is that in Spinoza, there isn't a reflexive thought. Homo cogitat, point. There isn't the necessity to recognize the form of this activity. So the proximity with Hegel is at the same time, in my opinion, a big distance. So this is only my remark, if you agree or no, I mean.
Yeah, sorry.
We take Dina too,
Yeah,
and
please.
so
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. You mentioned the expression acquiescentia in se ipso, no?
Right.
But Spinoza uses the term acquiescentia in two different expressions. Acquiescentia in se ipso indicates the second kind of knowledge, and acquiescentia mentis also is the consequence of the third kind of knowledge. I think that this is a very important difference, and I think it goes in your direction, I think, no?
Right.
Okay.
So,
It's only
7 seconds.
Seven
so
seconds.
thanks for the notation. I think that the English translation of Carly translates self-esteem and satisfaction of the mind. So thanks for the notion and for the distinction between second kind and satisfaction.
Is the term used by Descartes,
Right.
but Spinoza uses
Right.
the term
Acquiescence. Right.
from the Latin translator.
Right. And the English translator goes back to Descartes in a way. Thanks.
Giacomo.
Giacomo, I do not think it stands on the question of generation because it is too complex in 2 seconds. But about the reflexive instance, it's of course something totally different from Hegel. But I do not think that in Spinoza it's absent, totally absent. For the mind that is active, and it's active because it acknowledges, it cognizes. And I do not understand how would this be possible without be aware of this. And I think that the whole process of ethics goes in another direction. But sorry.